It all started on a stretch of empty highway somewhere between Oklahoma and Texas. I wasn't supposed to be there. Hell, I wasn't supposed to be involved in any of this. I was just a guy at a gas station, waiting for my coffee to kick in before continuing my cross-country drive. The early morning air was thick with dust, and the smell of gasoline mixed with sweat clung to my skin. That's when they pulled up. A beat-up van with tinted windows screeched to a halt beside me, and out came four guys who looked rougher than the gravel they parked on. The leader, a guy who called himself Jake, swaggered out like he owned the place. The others, I'd come to know as Derek, Sam, and Billy, followed his lead. They didn't notice me at first, or if they did, they didn't care. I was just a passerby, another forgettable face. As they were filling up, I couldn't help but overhear their conversation. Something about a heist. A successful one, from the sound of it. I didn't catch the details, but they were on edge. One of them kept glancing at the horizon, like he was waiting for someone, or something, to show up. Their voices were hushed, but I got the distinct feeling that whatever they had just done, it wasn't good. Then came the moment that changed everything. A lone hitchhiker appeared, walking down the side of the road like he'd been wandering for miles. He had a strange, crooked smile, the kind that makes your skin crawl for no reason. His name was Joe. At least, that's what he told them when they offered him a ride. And they did, without hesitation. Just like that, he hopped into the back of their van. I didn't know it at the time, but that hitchhiker was the last mistake those guys were going to make. I don't know what made me do it, but I followed them. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the unease I felt when Joe climbed into their van. Whatever it was, I couldn't let it go. So, I kept my distance, tailed them down the highway as they sped off, disappearing into the vastness of the open road. The first hour of their ride seemed normal enough. They laughed, talked about splitting their loot, and joked about what they were going to do once they crossed the border. I'm not sure if they noticed, but Joe was just sitting there, smiling to himself. That same creepy, crooked grin plastered on his face the entire time. He didn't speak much. And when he did, it was short, weird stuff, asking strange questions like, "You ever wonder what it's like to feel your heart stop?" At first, they brushed him off. Maybe they thought he was just some kooky drifter. But then, the weirdness escalated. Joe began humming. Not a tune anyone could recognize, but this slow, methodical sound, almost like a dirge. And the air in that van got thick. I could tell just from following them that something was off. The way the van slowed down, the way they stopped talking. It was like a spell had been cast over them, silencing their chatter. I pulled back, trying to keep my distance, unsure of what to do next. Then came the first game. "I like to play games when I travel," Joe said, breaking the silence. "Keeps the mind sharp." Jake, sitting in the passenger seat, finally snapped out of whatever trance Joe had put them in and laughed. "What kind of games?" he asked, trying to keep it light. I could hear it in his voice, though. He was on edge. "Simple ones," Joe replied. "Like? What would you do if you had to choose between cutting off your own hand or watching someone else die? Would you make the cut?" The van went silent again. I could see from behind that Derek, the driver, was gripping the wheel tighter. Even from where I was, following a few car lengths behind, I could feel the shift in the mood. "That's some sick shit, man," Billy said from the back seat, laughing nervously. But Joe didn't laugh. He just kept staring straight ahead, still wearing that creepy grin. "I'm serious," Joe said, his voice dropping to a whisper. Sometimes, the best way to learn about yourself is when you're forced to make impossible choices. Isn't that right? I don't know how, but it felt like Joe was talking directly to me, like he knew I was following them. It was at that moment I realized this wasn't going to end well for anyone. I knew something was seriously wrong when the van pulled over on the side of the road, out in the middle of nowhere. They were miles from any town, surrounded by nothing but flat, empty land and the occasional tumbleweed. I stopped my car a good distance back, just far enough to stay out of sight but close enough to see what was happening. Jake was the first to get out. He slammed the door behind him and started pacing, lighting a cigarette with shaky hands. I could see him muttering to himself, the calm demeanor from earlier completely gone. The rest of them followed, except for Joe. He stayed seated, staring straight ahead, his face illuminated only by the faint glow of the van's interior light. "Why the hell did we pick up this freak?" Derek shouted, throwing his hands up in frustration. "I don't know what it is, but something's not right with him." Billy, who was normally the tough guy of the group, looked pale. "Did you hear the shit he was talking about?" "Man, I don't want to hear any more of that, cutting off your hand, crap." Jake was trying to calm them down, but it was clear he wasn't so sure himself anymore. "He's just some messed up drifter, all right. Once we get across the state line, we'll drop him off. No big deal. We just need to keep moving." But it was too late. The tension was thick, like they all knew something was about to go down but were too afraid to admit it. Then, without warning, Joe got out of the van. He moved slowly, deliberately, like he had all the time in the world. His smile was gone now, replaced by a cold, distant stare. He walked right up to the group, his presence sending a ripple of discomfort through them. No one said a word as Joe just stood there, watching them like he was observing animals in a cage. "You know what I think?" Joe finally said, his voice low and calm. "I think you guys don't understand how lucky you are." "Lucky?" Derek scoffed, trying to act tough but failing miserably. "What the hell are you talking about?" Joe tilted his head slightly, eyes narrowing. "Lucky that you still have a choice. Lucky that you're not like me." He paused, letting the words hang in the air before continuing. "I wasn't always like this, you know. I used to be just like you. But then, things changed. And I learned a lot about choices." Nobody said anything. The air around them felt suffocating. That's when Joe pulled something out of his jacket, an old, rusted hunting knife. It wasn't fancy, just a beaten-up blade, but the sight of it made my stomach twist. He held it up, studying the blade as if it were the most fascinating thing in the world. Then, in the most casual voice, he said, "You want to play my game?" Jake stepped forward, trying to keep his cool. "Look, man, we don't want any trouble. Just get back in the van and we'll take you wherever you need to go." Joe's smile returned, but it was different now, darker, twisted. "You don't get it, do you?" he said, twirling the knife in his hand. "We're already playing." Before anyone could react, Joe grabbed Billy by the wrist and in one swift motion, sliced his palm wide open. Blood sprayed across the dirt as Billy screamed and fell to his knees, clutching his hand. Panic erupted. Derek lunged at Joe, but he was too slow. Joe dodged him easily, stepping back with that same eerie calm. "The game's simple," Joe said, his voice ice cold. "One of you bleeds, or all of you do." Jake and Derek stood frozen, unsure of what to do. Sam, who hadn't said much until now, just stared at the knife in horror. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. My heart was racing, and my mind screamed at me to drive away, but I couldn't. I was glued to the spot, watching as this stranger, this thing, unraveled their whole group like it was all part of some sick plan. And then Joe said something that chilled me to the bone. "There's a lot more blood to spill tonight." Billy was still on the ground, his hand gushing blood as he whimpered in pain. Jake tried to get a grip on the situation, barking orders like a man desperately trying to keep control, but it was clear to everyone, including Joe, that he had already lost it. "Derek, grab the first aid kit," Jake shouted, his voice shaky. Derek hesitated, eyes darting between Jake and Joe, the knife gleaming in the dim light. Joe just stood there, twirling the blade slowly between his fingers, his grin never faltering. Sam, meanwhile, was frozen, wide-eyed, breathing heavily, unable to move. Joe took a step forward, his boots crunching on the gravel, and Derek flinched, stepping back instinctively. The fear was palpable now. Joe wasn't just playing games, he was pulling them apart, piece by piece, unraveling their bravado like it was nothing. "That was just the first round," Joe said softly, almost like he was speaking to himself. "But the night's still young, boys." Jake finally snapped. "What the hell is wrong with you, man?" He lunged forward, fists raised, but Joe was ready. With a flick of his wrist, the knife flashed through the air again. This time, it grazed Jake's arm, not deep enough to do serious damage, but enough to make him stop in his tracks. "You can't win this way," Joe said calmly. "But I'll give you a choice. Always fair, right?" "I'm nothing if not fair." Jake clutched his arm, blood seeping through his fingers. "What choice?" he spat, trying to hide the tremor in his voice. Joe tilted his head, considering his words. "You can leave," he said. "Walk away from this mess. All of you, right now. But you leave the money." He pointed the blade toward the van, where their stolen loot sat hidden beneath a tarp. The realization hit them all at once. Joe didn't just want blood, he wanted everything. He was taking control of their lives, their choices, their future. "And if we don't?" Derek asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. Joe smiled again. "Then we keep playing." I could see the gears turning in Jake's head as he weighed the options. Leave the money behind and walk away, or face whatever madness Joe had in store for them. But here's the thing, they weren't going to leave the money. That much was clear. They didn't just risk everything for a bag of cash to abandon it now, no matter how dire things were getting. Jake looked back at the others, silently asking for their input. Billy was still groaning, clutching his hand, but Sam finally spoke up. "We can't let him win," Sam muttered. His voice was shaky, but there was a desperate kind of resolve in his eyes. "We took this score. We need to finish it." Derek nodded slowly, but there was fear in his eyes too. "Yeah, we can take him. We have the numbers." Joe just stood there, watching them like a predator watches prey, waiting for them to make the wrong move. And I could see it in their faces, they had already lost. It wasn't about numbers. It wasn't about strength. Joe had control, and they were playing his game now. "Your choice," Joe said, stepping back, giving them space. "But remember, once you're in, there's no going back." That's when things spiraled out of control. Jake lunged again, this time going for Joe's throat. But Joe was faster than any of them expected. In one fluid motion, he ducked, twisting out of the way, and in the blink of an eye, the knife flashed again, this time slicing across Jake's leg. Jake stumbled back, howling in pain as he fell to the ground. Chaos erupted. Derek grabbed a tire iron from the van and swung wildly at Joe, but Joe dodged it like he was toying with him. Sam tried to help Jake, but there was no clear plan, no coordination. It was pure panic, a mess of violence and fear. Joe, for his part, was enjoying every second of it. His calm, eerie grin never wavered as he danced between them, avoiding their desperate attempts to strike back. It was like watching a cat play with a mouse, letting them think they had a chance before pulling the rug out from under them. And I just sat there in my car, frozen, watching the madness unfold. My heart pounded in my chest, every instinct screaming at me to drive away, to get the hell out of there. But I couldn't. It was like I was trapped in this nightmare, as much a part of the game as they were. Then, in the middle of the chaos, Joe stopped. He stood perfectly still, his back to the van, watching them struggle and fight amongst themselves. "You boys have a lot of spirit," he said, his voice cutting through the air like a knife. "But spirit won't save you." And just like that, he turned and walked calmly toward the van. They didn't even see what was coming next. Joe moved with eerie calmness toward the van while the others were still scrambling, their adrenaline spiking and their plans falling apart. Jake was on the ground, bleeding from his leg, groaning in pain. Derek was still gripping the tire iron, but now his hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold it. Sam, wide-eyed and panicked, crouched beside Jake, trying to stop the bleeding with his jacket. Joe opened the back of the van and rummaged through their stolen loot like it was no big deal. He whistled softly as he pulled out one of the duffel bags, slinging it over his shoulder. "You really thought you could get away with all this?" Joe said, his voice light, almost teasing. Derek finally snapped. He stormed toward Joe, tire iron raised high. "Put that down," he yelled, his voice cracking with fear and rage. He wasn't thinking clearly. None of them were. Joe didn't even flinch. He simply turned around, looked Derek dead in the eye, and tossed the duffel bag onto the ground. Then, with a sickeningly calm grin, he raised his knife. "You still don't get it, do you?" he said. "It was never about the money." Derek froze, unsure of what to do next. His confidence shattered, he stood there like a deer in headlights. The tire iron dangled uselessly from his hand as he watched Joe step toward him. "Here's the thing about choices," Joe continued, almost conversationally. "Sometimes, they're an illusion. Sometimes, no matter what you do, you lose." And then Joe did something no one expected, he dropped the knife. It clattered onto the dirt between him and Derek, lying there like a dark promise. What the hell are you doing?" Derek stammered, confused, his grip tightening on the tire iron. Joe took a step back and held up his hands, as if surrendering. "I told you," he said, his voice soft but chilling, "I like games. So, here's your choice. One last round. You can pick up that knife and come at me. You might even win. Or, you can let me walk away. No tricks. No more games. It's up to you." The silence that followed was suffocating. Jake, bleeding out on the ground, stared up at Derek, his face pale with shock. Sam stood frozen, his mouth half open, not knowing what to say or do. And me? I was gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles were white, torn between staying hidden or jumping out to do something, anything, to stop the madness. Derek's eyes flicked between Joe and the knife on the ground. It was clear that he didn't trust Joe, but there was something in his eyes, some small, desperate part of him, that wanted to believe there was a way out. That if he didn't pick up that knife, maybe, just maybe, this nightmare would end. But as he hesitated, Joe's smile grew wider. "Tick-tock, Derek," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the rustling wind. Derek made his choice. He dropped the tire iron, letting it clatter uselessly onto the ground, and bent down to pick up the knife. The moment his fingers wrapped around the handle, everything changed. Joe lunged forward faster than anyone could react. In one swift motion, he grabbed Derek by the wrist and twisted, forcing the knife out of his hand. Before Derek could even scream, Joe had him in a chokehold, dragging him to the ground with terrifying strength. The rest of us watched, helpless and horrified, as Joe squeezed tighter and tighter, cutting off Derek's air until he stopped struggling altogether. Sam stumbled backward, eyes wide with terror. Holy shit, he cried, looking at Jake, who was too weak to help, too shocked to process what was happening. Joe stood up, casually brushing the dirt off his clothes. He looked at Sam, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. You see? Choices. For a moment, no one moved. It was like time had stopped. Jake lay there, clutching his leg, too weak to fight. Sam was paralyzed, his mind clearly racing, trying to figure out how they'd all ended up here. How a simple robbery had turned into something far more nightmarish. Joe looked over his shoulder at the open road, at the horizon where the sun was just beginning to fade. Time's almost up, he said, turning his attention back to Sam. I told you, there's more blood to spill tonight. I just haven't decided whose yet. I was still in my car, heart pounding, mind racing, knowing that things had gone too far. I had stayed silent this whole time, hidden like a coward, but I knew now, I had a choice to make too. I sat there, my pulse thundering in my ears as I watched Joe take control of the situation like it was all a sick game he'd been planning from the start. Derek was out cold, possibly worse. Jake lay on the ground, barely conscious, and Sam, well, Sam was just a dead man walking, though he didn't seem to know it yet. Joe stood there, admiring his handiwork, and then glanced over his shoulder, his eyes locking with mine. My breath caught in my throat. He had noticed me, my car parked far enough back to go unnoticed until now, but I could see it in his face, he had known all along. He knew I'd been following them. My mind raced. I could drive away, call the cops, and let them handle this psycho. But I wasn't sure anyone would survive until help arrived. The way Joe moved, the calm precision of his every step, it was like he was always one step ahead. Like he wanted me to be here. To watch. Then, Joe did something that chilled me to the bone. He waved. Not an aggressive wave, but a casual, almost friendly gesture, like he was inviting me into his twisted game. I swallowed hard. I had to act. Pushing down the fear that had been paralyzing me for the past hour, I made a decision. I threw the car into gear and sped toward them. My tires kicked up dirt as I skidded to a stop a few feet away. I jumped out of the car, trying to seem more confident than I felt, and shouted, "Enough. This stops now." Joe's expression didn't change. In fact, his grin grew wider, like this was all part of the fun. He didn't say anything as I approached, and the silence was unbearable. Sam looked at me like I was some kind of miracle, like I might somehow save them from this nightmare. But I didn't have a plan. I was just acting on instinct now. "Get away from them," I said, my voice cracking. "You've done enough." Joe tilted his head, studying me like I was a puzzle he was trying to figure out. "Oh, you finally decided to join the party," he said, his voice soft and mocking. "I was wondering how long you'd watch before stepping in. Brave or foolish? I haven't decided yet." I glanced at Sam, who was trembling, his hands shaking as he stood frozen. Jake wasn't moving anymore, his breathing shallow. If I didn't do something, they were both going to die. Derek was still unconscious, crumpled in a heap near the van. "I'm giving you a choice," I said, trying to mimic Joe's earlier words. "Walk away. Right now. Or this ends here." I gestured toward my car, my hand shaking just a little too much to sell the threat. I didn't have a weapon, but I hoped Joe thought I did. For a moment, I thought Joe might laugh. But instead, he sighed, almost like he was disappointed. I was really hoping you'd be smarter than that. He slowly crouched down, picking up the blood-stained knife he had dropped earlier. You want to play hero? Fine. But heroes always die in the end, don't they? My heart raced. Joe took a step toward me, knife gleaming in the dying light. I had to think fast, had to do something before he closed the distance. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the air. I flinched, and so did Joe. He turned, confused for the first time, and I realized what had happened. Sam, in a moment of desperation, had grabbed the tire iron Derek had dropped and swung it with all his might, hitting the side of the van instead of Joe. The sound was deafening in the stillness. It gave me just enough of a distraction. Without thinking, I lunged forward, tackling Joe to the ground. We hit the dirt hard, and the knife flew out of his hand, skittering across the gravel. Joe struggled underneath me, but I held on with everything I had, adrenaline pumping through my veins. Sam! The knife! I yelled, barely holding Joe down as he twisted and fought back. Sam, shaking and terrified, scrambled for the knife. He grabbed it, holding it awkwardly in his hands, his eyes wide with fear and confusion. What do I do? He screamed, his voice cracking. Just, don't let him get it. I grunted, wrestling Joe as he tried to break free. His strength was unreal, like something out of a nightmare. I wasn't sure how much longer I could hold on. Joe stopped struggling for a moment and looked up at Sam, smiling even as he lay pinned beneath me. You don't have it in you, Sam, he said softly. You're not like me. Sam froze, the knife shaking in his grip. I could see the doubt creeping into his eyes, the way his resolve wavered. Do it! I shouted, my arms burning from the effort of holding Joe down. We have to end this. But Sam couldn't move. He was paralyzed by fear, by the horror of what was happening. And that's when Joe started laughing. Low and guttural at first, but it grew louder, more manic, until it filled the empty air around us. His body shook with the force of it, and I felt him start to shift beneath me. In that moment, I realized something terrible. Joe wasn't scared. He was enjoying this. All of it. The fear, the blood, the choices. He had been in control from the very beginning. The laughter stopped, and Joe looked up at me with dead, empty eyes. You can't win, he whispered. And for a second, I believed him. Everything happened in a blur after that. Joe's words hung in the air, you can't win. I could feel the fight draining out of me as his twisted grin seared itself into my brain. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw Sam move. He didn't lunge. He didn't shout. He just acted. With a sudden burst of adrenaline, Sam drove the knife into Joe's side. It wasn't a perfect strike, hell, it wasn't even a fatal one, but it was enough. Joe's laughter cut off, replaced by a sharp gasp as the pain registered. His body jerked under me, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I saw something resembling fear in his eyes. Joe's hands shot to his side, clutching the wound, but it wasn't enough. Blood seeped through his fingers, dark and thick. His strength began to fade, and I could feel his body weakening beneath me. He wasn't invincible. He wasn't some unstoppable force. He was human after all. Sam stood there, trembling, the knife still in his hand. His face was pale, his eyes wide with shock at what he had just done. I could tell he hadn't expected to go through with it. Neither had I. Did we do it? Sam whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of Joe's labored breathing. I slowly got off Joe, my legs shaking as I stood. Joe was still alive, but he was fading fast. He lay there on the ground, clutching his side, staring up at the darkening sky. For a moment, he didn't say anything. He just stared, that same eerie calm settling back over him as blood pooled around him. Then, he chuckled. It was weak, barely more than a raspy breath, but it was there. That same damned laugh. You think it's over? Joe rasped, his voice barely above a whisper. It's never over. I looked down at him, my chest heaving, anger boiling inside me. You've lost, I said through gritted teeth. This ends now. Joe's smile faded, and for the first time, I saw something else flicker across his face, disappointment. He coughed, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth, and he whispered, "There's always another game." And then, finally, he was still. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Sam was frozen, still clutching the knife like it might spring back to life at any moment. I couldn't move either. I just stood there, staring down at Joe's lifeless body, trying to process everything that had just happened. The wind picked up, carrying with it the distant sound of traffic on the highway. It was over. It had to be over. I walked over to where Jake lay, still breathing but unconscious from the blood loss. Sam knelt beside Derek, who was coming around, groaning as he blinked against the pain. We were alive, beaten, broken, but alive. I didn't know what to say. How do you wrap your mind around something like this? I wasn't some action hero who knew how to handle this kind of madness. I was just a guy who had the misfortune of getting involved. A guy who, like them, made the mistake of crossing paths with Joe. After a few minutes, I found my voice. We need to call for help, I said, my voice hoarse. Get Jake to a hospital. Tell them everything. Sam nodded numbly, pulling out his phone with trembling hands. Derek sat up, wincing as he touched his bruised neck. None of us made eye contact. None of us knew how to process what had just happened. As Sam dialed for help, I looked back at Joe's body, lying there in the dirt. I should have felt relief, but all I felt was a gnawing dread deep in my gut. I kept hearing his voice, that final, haunting whisper, "There's always another game." And somehow, I knew he wasn't lying. When the cops arrived, they didn't believe the full story at first. Who would? A serial killer hitchhiker who played twisted games with his victims. It sounded like something out of a horror movie. But the bodies, the blood, and the shattered lives we left in our wake were proof enough that something had happened out there. Something they couldn't explain. Sam and I never really spoke again after that night. He disappeared into his own world, trying to move on, I guess. Derek survived, but he was never the same either. None of us were. As for me, I can't forget Joe. Even now, late at night, I sometimes hear his voice in my head, whispering those cursed words, making me wonder when the next game will start. Because deep down, I know there's someone else out there. Someone like him. Waiting for the next poor soul to pick them up on the side of the road. So, here's my advice to you. If you ever see a hitchhiker, no matter how harmless they look, no matter how desperate they seem, keep driving. Because you never know who, or what, you might pick up.